How to meaningfully inhabit a space. How to weave ourselves into a new territory. To think the project of human inhabitation in present times. The initial impulse for this season of Woods in the Sound is a personal, collective journey. A journey of foresta to become a real forest. Our search for spaces of the possible, to say it with Isabel Stengers, a search for making a home for a multi-species collective. So what can we learn from vernacular, contemporary and emerging knowledges of spatial practices, as well as multilingual situated dialogues? Can architecture support multi-species conviviality? This season unfolds as a relational research as necessity, becoming a context for a collective sense-making, seeking vocabularies and articulating ideas that may enact ecologies of practice in our search for more inclusive and regenerative inhabitation.
In this episode, we slowly move towards more grounded realities and situated contexts within planetary inhabitations, turning our gaze to regrounding and potentialities for a renewed relationship with the place. Global problems tend to have local beginnings. So how do we cohabit our localities differently? And while framing situations and organizing spatial experiences, how can architecture contribute not to more alienation, but to restoring of connections with places, fostering relations in ways that are not abstract, but that make us feel part of the place where we find ourselves? As usual, before we begin, I would like to thank all the contributors to this episode, human and not only, all the places, all the practitioners and thinkers, all those who have directly and indirectly informed this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Let's begin again.
Being planetary as praxis, writes an author and scholar Jennifer Gabris, involves working from within the forests, thinking through and working toward modes of being neither from a ground or grounding, nor from above in a position of mastery or partitioning, but from within the middle of asymmetrical yet non-subjugating planetary relations. Continuously reflecting on life on the planet as entanglements within multi-species assemblages, could we think of places as multi-species commons or planetary commons? And how to think the commons and being commoners with dignity within the entangled processes of becoming with a place.
The thing that we've been ignoring is the importance of the local. And your theme of kind of how does space become home, really about, well, what does it mean to turn something that's become abstract, that's become something that you can just sell more product in, that has been kind of made, kind of the individuality of these places gets ignored when you introduce some kind of mass technology. Whereas when you actually live with the plants around you and start to notice what's made a home in that tiny, little crevice in the concrete or something, then you're actually recognizing your place and the land that is kind of beneath your place or of your place. And that's just texturally so much richer.
If we look back in history and how commons were in history, like shared space was shared access to natural resources, for instance. Of course, it also included nature and different species, plants, animals, livestock. So I guess the commons as such is basically the sharing of resources. But historically speaking, of course, with the human in the center, like the humans as the organizing principle for this. And I think what is happening now within different disciplines and approaches is that we actually gradually come to learn that humans should no longer be the center of the creation of things. So, and here we have the notion of the more than human commons, or the multispecies commons, as something, as I see, as basically a learning principle for us humans to actually gradually start to be aware of other species' existence.
You know, Elinor Ostrom, who wrote about the governing the commons, noted in all of her political economic calculations and equations that she was working on, she notes that when the commons are managed by a remote hegemonic leviathan, a giant corporation or a government at some remote location, they do a pretty bad job because they don't have any of the feedback mechanisms. You don't see the collapse of that ecosystem or of that species. Whereas if you're living in the forest and you're seeing that over-harvesting is producing these effects, you're more likely to protect that, especially if you're part of a community. And so I think our exposure to forests is a really big piece of this too, the work that you're doing and thinking about. And that exposure is a way to create familiarity, which breeds generally, I think, kindness. You know, I think there's a kind of sense that if we have knowledge of these systems and we can receive the feedback that they're providing us and we can live within it as opposed to against it, then I think there's some, this is super optimistic, but I believe there's hope.
We don't have very much forest around here. We have tree plantations, a lot of spruce plantations, but forest, no, we don't have almost nothing. Most people that they can walk in what they think is a forest and really enjoy it, thinking it's really a good, nice forest vibe. But then when you look at it, you see it's only one tree, and they're pretty much the same age, and they are spaced pretty evenly. And if you and under it, it's pretty much only maybe 4 or 5 different species of moss and not so much lava. So that's not really a natural forest, because a natural forest is not the same age, for example, and not one species. It's about biodiversity and resilience against the storms and against the fires and bugs and everything. That is so poor in those plantations. Sweden exports very much timber all over the world, and the politicians are very afraid of losing export. It's like a motor of the economy in a sense. But it's not a motor for our economy here. The local economy is really suffering from the forest systems as it is works today, because they just cut down everything and leave nothing. And there's one person sitting there in a giant machine, walking around doing this. It really doesn't give you any jobs. The forest owners, they are forced to do this because there's really no other way right now to, like, you can't get rid of your spruce plantations in another way, and you get bad pay, and then you have to start over, and it's just a mess. The only places where you can actually sell your timber is the big sawmills, and they only are interested in clear cuts. And now you can see, like, those second generation clear cuts, they grow, nothing grows there. It doesn't want to become forest again, because when you cut everything away, take away all the shade, and especially now we get a lot of droughts, all the moss and everything that holds the moist, it just like crumbles and just flies away with the wind, and just ruins the soil completely. And then you're just left with this like mineral earth that is, you can't really grow anything in that. I think people are beginning to understand that this is not working. It's not good for, at least it's not working for the people that owns and lives in the forest. It works really good for the people exporting timber. They make a lot of money, but we as forest owners really don't need to take responsibility for their system, even if it's even if it is a motor in our national economy. It's really not a good argument for me to cut down all my forests, because that's what you get, like when you say, but this system doesn't work, and they say you have to think about the export.
This idea of cost efficiency is a construct which is very narrow way of measuring any kind of benefit. You know, it's got a narrow time frame for value and valuation. It doesn't look at the externalities of what other impacts are created and costs are created outside of the narrow analytical boundary that you set. We're really bad, and actually advanced capitalism doesn't really want to talk about the externalities of what it means to overharvest trees or dig out too much soil for mining, or losing a species. What's the value of, or the cost to us in quantitative financial terms? What's the cost of losing a species? You know, how do we put a dollar or a euro value on, a renminbi value on that? And so in some senses, I think we need different currencies to describe these things. For us, you know, we always said if carbon were a currency, rather than a thing we try to monetize using our typical economic models, we would maybe start financing things with an eye towards systemic change around greenhouse gas emissions or carbon storages. And so I know that right now, what's happened is we're in a situation where all the infrastructures and the systems of analysis make the conclusion that your people who showed you the eucalyptus forests inevitably come to the conclusion that cutting everything at once, clear cutting, was cost efficient. But I think that the model is flawed. And it's the same with not just cost analysis, but finance. You know, we want to financiers like to finance technologies, invest in technologies, because they can measure exactly what the unit is and they can see what the returns will be. And what we really need is to think about system finance. Like, how do you invest in across the system rather than just for a certain technology or potential product? And I think it can't just be a model of we invest in forests to store as much carbon as possible, because that might not be the best solution for that forest. We want to look more broadly at all those impacts, and we want to try to put a value on each of the criteria that we use to make investment decisions.
So what people start to realize, especially the people living in the forest, the people that are actually supposed to cut down and sell the forest. They are the ones that love their forest the most. They often grew up there and they hunt there and they pick their berries and the mushrooms and everything. The kids play there. Unfortunately, they are like really forced to cut down, and they also think that they are being good forest owners by doing that. Right now, it's becoming more or less like a political identity question. So either you are vegetarian or you are like, I have to have my meat, and you like nuclear power, you like wind mill power. There's nothing in between. I think that it's really hard effort on making this forestry question into a political identity question, that you really need to, if you don't want to have clear cuts, you have to buy all the other like political standings that your side will have, and it's just such a stupid and not dysfunctional way of seeing your community, and it also serves a purpose for the industry to keep things as they are. At the same time, it's very important to let this old system like die in grace in some way, because if you come up to someone that spent their whole life working in the forest thinking that they did a really good thing, trying to get the trees as ready as possible for the clear cut, because I mean it's a lot of work for the owner to plant them and then cut away everything that wants to grow up. I mean, it's a fight against nature for 80 years. It's a lot of work, and they're proud of their forest and they are proud of the work they've done. And if you go tell them that what you've done is just wrong, it's just stupid, and you won't get any results from that. So in some ways you need to like find a better system to make the old one obsolete. What we hope and what we think also will come with the change of generation as as forest owners is something that's called continuity forestry, in Swedish at least, or in Sweden we call it naturnära, so it's close to nature or nature close forestry, and it's more about taking out a little bit every few years instead of cutting everything down every 80 years or something and then restart and hope that it will become a forest again for your grandkids to cut down again. But in this way you wait for a tree to get the right diameter before you cut it down, and that will give you like the best price for the timber.
Forests can recover. The question is, how can we support that? So some way I feel like it's pulling in our skirts, making the life within our cities more nature-based, supporting more bioregional economies rather than global ones, experiencing those natural systems that exist around the cities where we live, and doing our best to experience and support them, and making policies that are based on those bioregional systems rather than political boundaries. And I think ultimately what you get is a population that is, maybe it starts being because it's worried about the collapse of global natural systems, but it ends with a kind of love affair, between people and these places that they live in. And I see this all over the world, where people are really, really fond of the places where they live and they are very knowledgeable about them, and yet they buy things and they consume things and they make things in ways that don't reflect that love at all. And I think we have to kind of come to a realization that how we act has a direct impact on the things that we love, and forests are a great example of that.
I really believe in bioregional approaches because certain climate conditions and certain geological conditions give us frame and give us constraints for how we can live somewhere. When the train arrived and the start of the Industrial Revolution, we started to transport the materials from that were disconnected from that natural environment. And I'm a strong believer that if we are able to understand how water flows, how the soil is constituted, how people have lived there in a certain way, we're able to grow certain things, and we're being part of nature and not disconnected from nature. When you respect that and then you create an environment where that all the stakeholders, people, craftsmen, scientists, industries, economies, children, together with plants, animals, can, with infrastructures that are there over the ages, can live together in a certain harmony, if you respect that. And many of these links are broken, and a bioregional design approach or bioregional approaches can weave together these connections, and you can build again networks, local networks, and that makes societies and communities resilient. And that is what we need, I think. We don't need efficiency, we need resiliency. And for resiliency, you need connection and diversity. That means like many different people, many different stakeholders, many different players, actors that are connected by similar, you could say, projects. That can be architecture, that can be design, that can be food, that can be, and they all interrelate with each other and they are interwoven, and that creates an environment that is strong, that is rich, that is complex, and that is probably not that is not something you can copy paste to another part of the world, as is happening a lot today with buildings and architecture and even food that is like copy pasted from one place to another place without adapting it to the local context. Is there a farmer that has straw, or is there somebody who is doing forestry and is doing trees? And how can you build economies with these people and weave, in fact, with the landscape and with the people and with the infrastructure or the underused infrastructures, this kind of architecture? And so it's this kind of building of connections that can be that is very important. They can be soft, they can be strong, they can be they can have all kind of formats of connections, but it's very important that they are there and that they can be activated when needed or when is necessary. That you really can create these economies around it. You create other income streams for farmers, for instance, or people that are dealing with wood or stones or earth and so on. So you create for them in this very fragile world where monoculture and efficiency is like celebrated, you create a kind of possible diversification. And that is where we need to go to. We need to go away from monoculture and go to polycultures. So there you have tools to start speaking with farmers, with people that are dealing with materials, to do other things with waste streams, with flows, to think differently about the materiality that they have in their hands, and see the value differently. And this is how architecture and certain buildings or projects can act as a kind of demonstrator of possibilities and can activate a group of people, communities of practice.
For me personally, place, I've come to define it now a bit later in my life within the concept of home place of bell hooks. And home place is site of resistance, but also the possibility or building the possibility for a community of resistance, or where you find certain shelter, safety in the presence of knowledge, ancestral knowledge. And why I've been thinking about this a bit more, to think of then how can we build a home place and nurture not only collective awareness, but a sense of knowledge to repair then the places that we call home. Regeneration is not about introducing the politics of progress into indigenous knowledge, but it's really about renewing the connection to the capacity of the land or community to hold this ancestral knowledge or indigenous knowledge. It's about retapping into this capacity and rechanneling the potential. I find that is regenerative practice.
We have to think of a place as a story, and a certain world we co-make, we inhabit together a certain way of life, and this particular story and the way of life connected to it is an artifact from a time in which certain people were writing histories. To recover these histories, we have to look into, we have to sort of trace, particular clues, one of the ways I've been doing this is by examining the life world of the beaver in contemporary Netherlands and tracing it back to the past. So beaver were once considered to be socially significant others, were probably the reason that people came here again and repopulated this area after the Ice Age. So we lived really in a beaver world, and then over thousands of years, that relationship changed and culminated in the extinction of beaver. And now beaver are back, and they are systematically sabotaging the world that we have built. When we think about the beaver as one of the pioneer species after the Ice Age and the rewarming of this particular continent, the retraction of ice sheets, the beaver were one of the first, and they really created these landscapes with many ecological affordances. So when we think of beaver, we think of wetness, or like how they are holding water, and they don't only increase the amount of water in a place, they increase the interface between so-called land and water, but they also increase the gradients of different types of wetness in providing their own means of life, their own means of subsistence. They create these incredibly differentiated ecotones. The first edition of this book I'm working on, here it reads, "Beaver are ontological mutineers, figures of friction who point towards systemic fractures by ornamenting the cracks, who show us our lines never truly connect and everything is only partial." We can think of place as a inhabitation, a construction of a certain niche in a landscape that has then transformed the landscape. And we have to ask who is benefited by this niche, who has propagated this way of life. We can also think of a place in terms of a bioregion, or a way or a constellation of bioregions. Places are often on the threshold of certain ecological systems. A place can also be thought of as the footprint of a community or a city or a society, with all the connections to resources, and also the connections to where its wastes go. And then we can think of how we operationalize landscapes. What are the hinterlands of the planetary urban? If we think about global urbanization and flows of commodities and pollution, where does a place begin and end? And then also, I think as architects, we're primed to think of space and time when we are asked about space, and then matter. But lately I've been really interested in the philosophical project of Thomas Neel, who tries to outline a philosophy based on movement as primary rather than space or time or matter. And I think intuitively to architects this makes sense, because when we draw, we also move, and we always think of the embodied, the movements that the economies of movement, the rituals of movement. And in the Netherlands, we're in a gridded landscape. It's easy to think of space as a sort of tabula rasa, and then a place as something sort of placed on top of that rather than integrated into it. And in a sense, we've also really made it into that.
Philosopher, I think Heraclitus, talks in terms of flow, and the philosophers that we adopted talk in terms of state. So things become about objects. But when we look at a lot of indigenous worlds, they're operating with a much stronger sense of flow. And at the moment, and we also had our own process philosophy in the kind of turn of the 20th century, there were people who were starting to talk about what would happen if we moved from a state to to a sort of flow perspective. And what I see with entanglement and the more than human is actually a recognition in science that we operate in a flow world, and that it is only humans who pin things down, take the dragonfly, put it on a board, put a pin through it, and then say, oh, this is what the dragonfly is. But that's only a moment in the dragonfly's life.
Architecture is a practice that is about how togetherness is produced and how different violence, disagreement is also contained in these forms of bodied, these forms of bodied togetherness. And I think that those forms of bodied and environmentalized and ecologized togetherness are trans-species and are trans-scalars. And I'm not saying interspecies or interscalar because it's different. When I say trans, I refer to the way realities are produced in the transition. And transitioning is not departure from a point to land elsewhere, but it's the act of being in between what is important in transitioning. So it's not connecting two realities or producing an exchange or a collaboration between two realities. It's rather that things are in transitioning. So the notion of species fails if it's considered something that is fixed and that is an absolute reality. Life is transitioning from some species to others, and that character of being transitioning allows for multiplicity, allows for hybridity, allows for temporarity and performativity being a fundamental part of the physicality of bodies and environments and climate and ecosystems. And that transition is crucial. The same happens with scale, and this is crucial for architecture practices, I could say, is that what happens at the scale of molecules, it's having an effect and it's being affected by things that are happening at the scale of the planet. And this transitioning across scales, how transformations at the scale of a brick are crucially informed and being informed and have an agency on processes that happen at the scale of mountains or at the tiny level of scale of molecules is what it's characteristic about architecture.
What would have happened if 2,000 years ago, instead of adopting states as our primary concept, we'd adopted flow as our primary concept? What world would we have now?
We see architecture as a part of the metabolic systems of the planet, and we trying to investigate the projects in which the circulation of water and light oscillation and gravity, so all those like forces which are responsible for the reproduction of the Earth, are as well treated as a components by the architects. And we trying to look at the flows as equal as the objects.
If you think about the flows rather than the objects as an inherent component of architecture, then you're able to change your mindset, thinking that the greatness of architecture is not depending on its scale, but on the scope of the phenomenon that it connects you to. So in a sense, if you're able through architecture to appreciate the rotation of the planet or the different types of rain or like the flows of the currents, then simultaneously you can connect the place where you are to the scale of your continent, of your region, and of the planet itself. Like one of the key word that we try to relate to when approaching these projects is like chronobiology. I don't know if you if you heard that, like in 2017, I think scientists got a Nobel Prize for realizing that the cells of our bodies means everyone's bodies, also the bodies of the plants and all the our bacteria, all the other than human beings which inhabit this planet. They are kind of in tune with the circadian cycles, with the cycles of the day and the night, with the passing of the seasons. So in a sense, we try to understand what then like a chronobiological architecture could mean. So it means that if there is a certain relationship, entanglement in between the way we live and the rotation of our planet, then our architecture can try to foster this relationship. We designed for this Venice Biennale in 2018 an object called the Rain Pavilion, in which the form of the Rain Pavilion was directly coming from the shape of the rains it was supposed to amplify. And we approach in this workshop with the students in this very same way. So you guys go out and observe how water circulates, and on the basis of this observation, then you learn how to be an architect and how to deal with water, without having like a predetermined idea on how water would behave, because you never grasp it otherwise if you don't first observe how it moves, what it can grant you, and how to connect with it.
Somehow for us architecture is not the envelope which is supposed to like cut out you from the natural cycles. It's part of nature, so we think that even the simple space can make you like much more in tune with the changes, natural forces.
We studied all the vernacular solution, mostly for Polish history, of typologies that were blurring these edges, and they were showing that life chronobiologically was happening not inside of the house or outside of the house, but in a constant intermingling between these two. When the roof was open, because the smoke of the fire had to go out and the rain could come in, or like
seasonal spaces like verandas. The most like fascinated houses that we visited, they have this onion structure that are like, you know, they closing and opening up. This is why we went through the investigation in a connection to the history of textiles in the interiors, because we understood that the space used to be like clothed like our own bodies, and we found even the elements that it was not defined that this is a cover of your body or the space. It was sometimes for the bed, sometimes for your back. If we will switch off AC and we will wrap our personal spaces with the traditional, you know, like the door covers or like some extra layers for the winter, it's making us much more aware on like subtle changes. Because you know, before it was like, let's say, winter or hot seasons or like cold seasons for me. Now I know that there was 12 seasons phenologically.
In order to get back these feelings of like the sensibility, the possibility of sensibly observing these nuances and these slight changes, we need our architecture to help us in doing that. You can consider like a building as a mosaic of microclimates in which you can use some rooms in a certain time of the year and not the others. You can kind of take advantage of the onion structure as several envelopes. You could even consider that the amount of bodies that are in a house, they all together create a bubble of microclimate. So there is like several, from the softest devices as possible to some hard elements of architecture that can kind of help us in recovering these nuances.
Yeah, and then the space is not only about like a composition of volumes, it's much more about the composition of microclimates. And we believe that you can craft, you can make the artisanal microclimates, not with the electrical like heaters, but by like, for example, providing the color contrast, different thermal, which is causing different thermal responses. You can partner with plants. You can shape the terrain in a way that you can maybe not conduct, but you can somehow guide the winds, and you can always like use some green screens. All that knowledge was like I think obvious for the landscape designers from the mid-century. And when we understood that, for example, the landscape composition were not about how the plants looked like, how the color like palette was like organized, but how they were like creating microclimates. That was very like for us inspiring, because we believe that architects can do the same with the different materials and with mostly with the partnership with the other living beings.
Here I also have to think about symbiotic relationships. And I feel it also takes a lot of courage to engage in such sorts, or to restore such sort relationships that we had before, but had to undo in order to then engage in modern progress. It's a sustainable exchange of knowledge, and it's a political allyship.
So whenever we talk about design practices or artistic practices or research practices, I think there's a huge job to be done in actually thinking and imagining otherwise when it comes to how we live with other species. So the question here is, how can we actually reimagine this whole idea of design with the commons and the more than human commons in mind, to actually understand environmental and more than human agency as a way of actually designing our ecosystems.
We can also underline again that architecture always has been operationalized to remove certain qualities of a particular land, instill other qualities as well. Like it has both capacities, but it has often been enlisted to act with the reigning power. And at this point, or at this moment, we're living in a neoliberal society under a capitalist regime, and the architecture is made to follow. So I feel if we are opening up new meanings of movement, not stopping certain flows of movement, the architecture also has to follow this practice of reconsidering what a line does, or reconsidering what the border does.
Yeah, what do we mean when we draw a line? Is it a fixity, or is it, to illustrate our own embodiment?
Yeah.
And therefore is like a choreography.
Yeah.
So when we think of a river, we think of it in terms of how it has been operationalized. We think of it, as disconnected from its floodplain. We think of it, as divorced from the cycle, the hydrological cycle, and rain and mist and all these other forms of wetness that really constitute our world. Yeah, Matur and D'Acunha say that the river itself is an object of design.
Yeah.
We have made the river with the practice of, architecture, design, draining, canalizing. Rather than what a river is, we should ask when a river is. How is a river? What does a river really serve? What does treating our environment as a line do?
I think architectures can hold tools for communal use, but also common liberation. And these specific tools are not only like hard tools, but also soft tools, particular ways of gathering, conversing, and understanding then the spaces that we inhabit.
It's about using a different kind of language and a different kind of there's a kind of hybrid form of talking in a way that's understandable, or points to a different future and might not immediately give a sense of clarity about what world we are going to inhabit together. And that is also where architecture can play an important role in just making images and
as an imaginative practice.
Yeah, as an imaginative practice, and also as a not only a kind of practice of instructions,
exactly,
but also of suggestion, of nudging us into ways of viewing possibility, of transforming our sense of the possible.
What we're describing needs a relationship with action. The practices that we describe or the architecture that we describe ultimately needs to be put down in specific structures that we can then learn from again. So it's this sort of iterative mode of communal learning, but also shaping and continuously shaping this communal horizon of liberation. Liberation of our bodies, liberation of the land, and liberation of our time. Because what time do we ally with? Think about architecture as a liberatory spatial practice. So I would also be interested in, like seeing what that could mean, not only for our direct environment, but also the landscape, the land, and the multi-species commons, all to be participating in a liberatory spatial practice and architecture for liberation.
With respect and awe for the intrinsic rhythms and forces of the natural world, with their different light, weather, temperatures, textures, biomes, the gifts of every place are planetary gifts. Becoming planetary is becoming local, connected to the place and being part of its generative processes. As the opportunity to emphasize those gifts, we sense an urgent need for another ethics of care for places, a reimagined approach to designing our local presences that may allow us to learn to live in and with places, being part of a very local ecosystem, while at the same time staying connected with and as planetary subjects.
Thanks for tuning in. In the next episode, we are continuing this path of inquiry, and we'll be looking at how our worlds may materialize not over others, but along with others. Looking at ways in which architecture and design can make our dwelling places more generous to other creatures.